And we're back for another episode of Professor Michael Welch.com to introduce the course Prisons and Prisoners. And these episodes allow us to provide some initial material information and details about this course on prisons and prisoners and how it is going to be instructed by yours truly. I left off on this item on my website going back to 1983. I was earning a master's degree in counseling psychology at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. And it was during this time I was also employed in a psychiatric unit. So I had hands-on experience, so to speak, in the psychiatric facility while I was attending graduate school, and obviously the two parallels were quite interrelated. And I mentioned that because it was a very important, very rewarding and valuable experience as a young man. And those of you who are taking college courses and wondering what you might do thereafter, I should mention a very interesting commencement address a couple of years ago at Rutgers University. We invited and had the honor of having a famous musician, Stevie Van Zandt, Little Steven, who was in the band with Bruce Springsteen. He also has his own band, the Disciples of Soul. And he said two things that I really thought was very insightful. He said, one, surround yourself by people who are better than you. And two, do something that interests you, because you are going to do that for a very long time. I mention that because I went to graduate school to study psychology and was interested in institutions. I was interested in helping people. I was interested in positive social change and so on and so forth. But from there, I was also interested in issues pertaining to criminal justice. And here I want to use a sociological term that allows us to understand this transition from one institution to another. Irving Goffman is arguably one of the most famous contemporary sociologists. And he wrote at length about total institutions. And he touched on various total institutions where the inmates, for example, in correctional institutions, were subjected to complete control by the authorities. But prisons are just one type of total institution. We have, of course, religious communities. And as you can see from my previous episode, I studied in the seminary. And our seminary was located inside a monastery. Contemplative monks. There were monks who did not speak. This was a total institution, and Irving Goffman goes to great length to dissect, to unpack how these institutions are made up and how they perform certain functions. Prisons, psychiatric institutions, as well as the military. I do not have a military background. My father does, my brother does. But they all these institutions share this common thread of following rules that are already established before they arrive. So when I made the transition from psychology to criminal justice and criminology, in 1984, I relocated to Illinois State University in Normal, Illinois. It was anything but normal. Ha ha. I had the opportunity to work with an amazing faculty there while I was earning another master's degree in criminal justice sciences. was interested in corrections, but also criminological theory. And I worked for an amazing psychologist who invited me to work as his research assistant, and we were working in the county jail. We were performing screenings. Since I had a background in psychometry, we were performing screenings for candidates who would then be considered to be hired by the county to work in the county jail. My professor was also really keen on extending his skills to graduate students who were taking a course on correctional counseling. And he hired me to work also with his correctional counseling course as a laboratory, meaning that he had set up these parallel rooms that were connected by a window. And in one room, the graduate students would role play a convict or prisoner with a counselor, and they would follow a particular script, or they would improvise, and so on and so forth. And I would be in the other compartment with the video camera, and I would videotape their sessions, and then we would together critique technique and so on and so forth. That's correctional counseling, which is very important in this field, because people who are incarcerated very often require some form of intervention on a voluntary basis, I might add. That's my personal therapeutic and clinical philosophy. So in this course, we're going to talk a little bit about this overlap between my work in psychology as well as how it extended into criminal justice sciences. But let me just leap ahead to my graduate training at University of North Texas in Denton, Texas, where I studied social organization, but also from a very applied standpoint. I was still interested and still engaged in mental health issues as well as criminology. The two were becoming increasingly overlapped. And I had the opportunity during this time to really exercise some of my own skills, my own background in psychology. I was hired as the correctional counselor in the county jail in Denton, Texas. And this was a maximum as well as a minimum security unit. And the courthouse was not too far away, so there was a lot of back and forth between pretrial detainees who were then being held at the minimum security prison. But we also had a fair amount of prisoners who were serving sentences less than a year. I'm mentioning this because you see this pathway of studying psychology and then merging it with criminal justice sciences and criminology, and then more broadly entering the field of sociology. It was also during this time that after I did a stint of about a year or so at the county jail as a correctional counselor, I was then offered an opportunity to join the U.S. Department of Justice in the Federal Bureau of Prisons to work as a social science research analyst at FCI Fort Worth. That is the Federal Correctional Institute at Fort Worth, Texas. Now, at the time, in the 1980s, Fort Worth, FCI Fort Worth, was a minimum security unit, built for about 600, but held about 1,000 at the time. More significantly, FCI Fort Worth was a co-correctional institution. They had male and female prisoners in the same institution. Let me clarify. They lived in separate dormitories, housing units, but during the day they commingled. They could dine in the cafeteria together, they could go for walks, they could hold hands. That was about it. Nothing beyond holding hands. They also could work they could work together, for example, in the kitchen or in the business office and so on and so forth. This was a minimum security prison, and many of these prisoners, perhaps the vast majority of them, were convicted of nonviolent offenses. So you could actually administer a co-correctional population. And what was interesting is that this was a time of transition in the Federal Bureau of Prisons, as well as by the 1980s, a major shift in patterns and trends in incarceration. And rather than getting into a much lengthier anecdote that will crystallize these sets of developments, I want to then pause one more time, or two more times, or three more times to get coffee, and come back and pick up with my work with the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and then how I then transitioned into a full-time academic. So let's pause.